Hello, I'm Lady Smith, Chair of the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry. Today, I publish my 15th volume of case study findings. They relate to the provision of residential care for children at Keil School, a boarding school in Dumbarton. Publication was due to take place earlier this year, but was held back at the request of the Crown to await the outcome of trial proceedings against William Bain, a physics teacher employed at Keil. Those proceedings had been raised after the conclusion of the evidential hearings and involved multiple charges of him having sexually abused children at a number of schools in Scotland, including Keil. They have now concluded, with William Bain having been convicted on 30th June 2025 at the High Court in Glasgow and sentenced to 9 years imprisonment. That was the second occasion on which he was tried and convicted on multiple charges of having sexually abused children at Keil School, the first having been in May 2016 when, following conviction, he was sentenced to 6.5 years imprisonment. Keil School was originally established in Kintyre by the McKinnon-MacNeill Trust, with the philanthropic intention of educating a small number of boys from the rural west of Scotland. The school moved from there to Dumbarton in the 1920s. Keil became a tough school where boys were expected to develop the ability to endure violence and suffer in silence. Prowess on the rugby pitches and achieving high ranking in the Keil hierarchy were prioritised. Education came second, and those who didn't fit the accepted mould suffered. Abusive practices became normalised in the late 1950s and remained so until the 1980s. Responsibility for the day-to-day running of the boarding houses was left to senior boys, with housemasters being distant figures, and some boarding house staff considering themselves immune from management. As a cost-saving measure, as well as it being the Keil tradition, responsibility for daily tasks fell to the pupils, so senior boys who had been appointed chiefs and their deputies were left to control squads of junior boys with limited supervision, if any. The attitude of teachers was largely that they were there to teach and nothing more than that. There was an assumption that children could be relied upon to look after the welfare of other children and to do so without adequate or proper oversight, but that was a serious mistake, particularly since there was no system to ensure consistency across the boarding houses in the school's approach to child welfare. Physical abuse by chiefs and deputies was perpetrated under the guise of it being official discipline. Some chiefs and deputies withheld food from other boys. Many simply beat them up, sometimes with implements such as books and wooden blackboard dusters, or they attacked them with geometry compasses. A few of them forced boys to put their hands over flames or boiling kettles. This was nothing short of torture. Children were exposed to and abused by paedophiles. In a disgraceful abdication of responsibility, protection of the reputation of the school was prioritised over the protection of children, with one predatory paedophile abusing children within Keil, unafraid of being discovered and able, with ease, to move on to teach elsewhere. That was William Bain, the physics teacher and house tutor, who, whilst employed at Keil between 1987 and 2000, sexually abused some children on hundreds of occasions and did so on an almost daily basis. That abuse persisted for years, despite concerns about the individual's behaviour arising early on after a parent complained. Inadequate investigation followed, and the problem was then covered up by headmaster Christopher Tongue and by other senior staff. Despite parents being assured that reports of his concerning behaviour would go on Bain's record, this didn't happen, and Tongue's successor as headmaster was never told about it. Against the background of all of Bain's offending, which included multiple visits by pupils to his private flat, it is alarming that there were repeated assertions by some members of staff that, since it was a small school with a family atmosphere, abuse would have been detected, whilst at the same time insisting they had no idea of Bain's activities. That is, they're saying they had no idea of the hundreds of occasions on which, by his own admission, boys were abused by him over more than a decade at Keil. That's very hard to accept. Another predatory paedophile was David Gutteridge. Described by his Keil victim as not the honourable gentleman he had thought him to be when he was at school, but in fact a sleazy, dirty old man. Gutteridge was employed as an English teacher and house tutor at Keil from 1989 to 1991. His abuse took place away from school after being carefully engineered. He groomed and persistently pursued a particularly vulnerable pupil. He abused him and was convicted at Forfar Sheriff Court in September 2024 of having indecently assaulted the pupil and sentenced to 17 months imprisonment. In 2015, he was sentenced to 18 months imprisonment at Harrow Crown Court on 2 charges of indecent assault of a teenage boy who he'd groomed and pursued in England in the 1980s, prior to his arrival at Keil. Some members of staff physically abused pupils under the guise of it being officially sanctioned punishment. The housemaster Ian Graham stands out and is remembered for his sadistic brutality. It took place within both a boarding house and his classroom. He conducted mass beatings and used the belt excessively in situations where corporal punishment was never merited. His behaviour was known throughout the school, but was never addressed or controlled. Governance was, for too long, remote and disconnected from the day-to-day lives of boarders, and governors failed to challenge the situation. That said, governors were never given adequate information about what was actually happening within the school. Keil's employment practices were poor. Teachers known to have abused children were not disciplined. Unsuitable staff were allowed to move on with supportive references. Prospective employers were not warned about their failings. Since the school closed in 2000, the McKinnon-MacNeill Trust has focused on that part of its purposes which involves promoting the advancement of education. They have not undertaken responsibility for any other school. The Trust apologised for the abuse experienced by children entrusted to the care of the school. The trustees were appalled by what they learned from the evidence. The abuse I find to have taken place at Keil is, in many respects, similar to the abuse I found to have taken place at other boarding schools, including Loretto School, Morrison's Academy, Gordonston, Queen Victoria's School, Merchiston Carson School, and the boarding schools run by 2 male religious orders, namely the Benedictines and the Marist brothers. My findings in relation to other boarding schools will continue to follow. I'm very grateful to all who have provided evidence to the inquiry, whether former pupils, former staff, or others. Their cooperation and assistance has been invaluable in enabling me to make these findings.